This week, we're starting off in John chapter 9. So for this week, you're going to have John chapter 9 and 10 as we get into this upcoming week. And as you'll notice, our background image today is a pair of muddy hands, which is what Jesus would have had after having done this miracle that we're going to read about. We're going to read about the sixth sign that Jesus does out of the seven, and then the eighth, which would have been his resurrection from the dead himself. And so we're noticing a pattern here that we're going through all of these signs. We're kind of flying through all these miracles of Jesus as we go through the early chapters of the book of John. And as we get into the later chapters of the book of John, we're going to notice that it's going to shift kind of dramatically. It's going to go through those signs, and then we're going to slow down, and we're going to learn a lot from the mouth of Jesus, and we're going to hear a lot of the words of Jesus to his disciples leading up to his crucifixion. And so that's super important that we recognize that that's happening, because it feels like we're going a million miles an hour through the early ministry of Jesus. And that's why here we're going to go through a bunch of miracles and then kind of slam into the wall that is the week of Passion. And that's going to be many chapters go into that fairly small space of time. So I want us to really kind of dive into these miracles each week because they represent reasons for why we ought to believe in Jesus Christ. As we go through, this is the Gospel according to John. This is beginning in John chapter 9, and your caption will say something like, Jesus heals a man born blind. And for John chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, we begin with a little bit of context. And I want you to recognize, first of all, that in John 9, you read that after John 8. Now that's obvious, right? We read in chronological order. We continue to read through this book. We read as the book continues. But I want us to notice what the last thing that was said and the last thing that happened in John chapter 8 was. It says, Jesus said to them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." So they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. Now notice what's happening there, that Jesus is going out of the temple. It's not his time yet to be crucified, to be killed by the Jews. And so he leaves the temple, and as he passed by, that's starting chapter 9, as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And they give us a little bit of the context for what this would have meant to a normal Jewish person of that time. They ask this question: who sinned, this man or his parents? Whose sin caused the problem here? According to the Reformed Study Bible, many first century Jews believed that every misfortune was God's punishment for a specific sin in the life of a specific person. And here we get to see a little bit of that. His disciples ask him, hey, who sinned? Because this guy was born blind, so did his parents sin? Was it his own sin? They kind of have this question that's happening. And Jesus dismisses that notion. And he says that this is not always consistently true. Certainly, God punishes sin with its equivalent consequences. We see that through our natural law. You can see that in your own life. If you've committed a sin, generally there is a consequence to that sin. We see that in the law that we abide by, but we also see that in our own lives. Certain sins have certain consequences. And you can see, for a biblical example, see 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 20, or chapter 12 through chapter 21, to see David's sin with Bathsheba and the consequent loss of his infant son. So we're going to be able to see that does happen. But Jesus says that's not what always happens. It's not always for sin. We must also be careful as we read this to uphold the biblical idea of original sin, as it's found in Romans chapter 5, verses 12 through 21. That idea says that all mankind is fallen into sin by our participation or headship in Adam. Those two words actually mean quite a bit. And I want to zoom in on those for just a moment. So it says fallen into sin by our participation or headship in Adam. There's two kind of broad theological categories that I think you guys are smart enough to understand this idea. There's kind of two ideas that could be true. Both are biblically backed, and we're just not sometimes there's interpretation differences, and I think this is one of them. Most Christians would hold that we are all sinful from our mother's wombs, and there's a reason behind that. And usually those fall into two camps. The first camp would be that we are sinful because in some real way we participated in that first sin. That is called realism. It's basically the thought that we in some way that we can't fully understand participated in this first sin. It was part of our nature, and therefore we are all sinful from our first moments. And so we can understand it that way by our participation. Or we can understand it, and there's some New Testament evidence for this idea, that we can understand it as a headship, that we weren't physically there, or we weren't spiritually there, or we weren't real in that moment, but that we experience sin because our head, Adam, sinned. The first man sinned, and therefore we follow in his footsteps. Either way, I think as long as we can understand that we come to this idea of original sin, I think that's healthy. Otherwise, we slip into these weird moments where we begin to think that sin isn't really a part of us, and so as long as we work hard enough, we can be good enough to not really be sinful, and I think that is a quick road to heresy. And so I want to make sure that we are upholding this idea as we continue to read through this text. This man was sinful. That's not what this text is saying. And as we'll go on, this will make more sense. But they ask, who sinned, this man or his parents, that this consequence happened? Why was he born blind? Why was there a consequence in play from his first moments? And so I want us to recognize that Jesus' answer does not take away this explanation. It just adds a layer to it. So the disciples are missing this crucial third possible answer to their question. So they expect one of two answers. They expect either the answer that the parents' sin caused the man's blindness. And to them, that would have made the most sense. The parents had to have sinned in some way, and if that's the case, then the man was born blind. They could have also expected this if they were really thinking, they were trying to think too smartly. They would have maybe thought that the man's sin, which had not been committed yet, but was already true of him in the womb, and again, by that original sin, had caused the man's blindness. Now, they would have had to jump through a little hoops to get there, but they could have gotten there. And that's also an option in their minds. But Jesus says a third option, which they did not think about to begin with. It says in verse 3, and it also, if we look at Romans 8:28 and 2 Corinthians 12:9 and 10, we get to see in verse 3, Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents." Surprise, neither of your answers are correct. "But that the works of God might be displayed in him." So this man was born blind so that the works of God, the good works of God, what God is doing here in the text, would be revealed in his life. That's crazy tough for us to fully grasp. But that's what's going on here in this text. This man was born blind that Jesus would have a miracle to do, unlike any miracle that had ever happened in the history of the world. And so in verses 4 through 7, we get to see that this is the sixth sign. Now I'm going to throw up a picture of the pool, the partially excavated pool at Siloam that Jesus sends this man to, and you guys can look at that. It's a little bit blurry. If you Google an image, there will be clearer images, but a lot of those are copyrighted. So I didn't want to use a copyrighted image. So this is a blurry image, but you can find clearer ones. These are the steps that lead down. So you can look at that as we read these verses 4 through 7. It says, "We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. There goes the muddy hands, right? Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. So he would have gone to a pool that he sent him to. Some critics think, oh, well, you just sent a blind man covered in mud off into the streets. How is he going to find the pool of Siloam? Remember, this is a grown man who has grown up in this city, in the city of Jerusalem, who has been blind his entire life. He knows this city quite well and knows how to get around without the use of his eyes. And he finds his way to this pool and he washes and he comes back clean. And then we lose Jesus for a little while, and just this story begins, the investigation of the miracle. And I love this part because this is what I would love to have been able to see and to do, at least parts of this. I like the fact that the Pharisees and the Jews around them and the neighbors have to know, how did this happen? How real really was this miracle? Whenever you see a miracle, you should test to see if it's valid. And so that's what these people do, though they take it significantly further than it needs to be taken. So we're going to go through this in pieces. It'll be in verses 8 through 29. We're going to go through 8 through 12 to start, and we're going to go through a couple of different actions that the people take. We'll also comment a little bit on how faithful some of these actions are. Beginning in verse 8, it says, "The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, Is this not the man who used to sit and beg? Some said, It is he. Others said, No, but he is like him. He kept saying, I am the man. So they said to him, Then how were your eyes opened? He answered, The man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, Go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and received my sight. They said to him, Where is he? He said, I do not know." So notice that they begin by questioning the man. They ask him all these questions. They're trying to figure out what actually happened from the first eyewitnesses. But as they come to the end of that questioning, you can tell that they are not really believing him, so they bring in the Pharisees. The Pharisees would have been the experts in the law, and so they could have known if this was a true thing or not. And so they come in and they ask this question. They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now, it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. We're going to keep seeing that problem over and over again. It was a Sabbath day. It was a Sabbath day. It was a Sabbath day. Recognize that would have been not great for them. In their opinion, you couldn't heal on the Sabbath. Obviously, that would be incorrect, but that was their opinion. And so you're going to notice that John makes that very clear, makes that point for us. In verse 15, we're going to start off again. So the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, He put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. Some of the Pharisees said, This man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others said, How can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. So they said again to the blind man, What do you say about him, since he has opened your eyes? He said, He is a prophet. Now, we want to recognize here that that's not a complete revelation of who Jesus is. He is more than a prophet. But this man at this point is just saying, this has to be a holy man. This has to be someone who can do amazing works that no man apart from God can do. And so whatever he's saying, whatever he's doing, it's true. It's of God. And that's what this man is saying here by saying he is a prophet. Notice the Pharisees keep asking the same question, making sure that his testimony stands up. It is true. So far, we're in a fairly healthy place. However, the Pharisees are questioning because they're saying that this man is not from God. Denying that the Messiah is from God is dangerous territory, and it's only going to get more dangerous as we continue in the text. So then they question the man's parents. They want to make sure this is actually the man, and so they go on in verse 18. The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked them, Is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? His parents answered, We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but how he now sees we do not know. nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He will speak for himself." So notice they ask the parents, and the parents confirm all of the facts, but then they start to seem hesitant. And why do they seem hesitant? And now is the point where we recognize that the Pharisees do not want to believe in the truth. And so we get to see that in this next verse, they are threatening that anyone who believes in Jesus would be excommunicated, would be kicked out of the temple fellowship. Verses 22 and 23, "His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, his parents said, 'He is of age. Ask him.'" And so a little bit, the parents kind of throw the son under the bus, but the son doesn't much care because he is now being able to see, and he wasn't able to see before. And so this is a miracle that has never really occurred before. And so we get to see that now the Pharisees are threatening, and soon these blind Pharisees are doubting the seeing blind man without reason. I want us to not miss that irony that is written into the text here, that the Pharisees are spiritually blind. And the blind man, who was once blind, is now both physically and spiritually able to see. And so I want us to see that because we're going to continue with that idea throughout this and the next chapter. And so as we read 24 through 29, "So for the second time they called the man who had been blind and said to him, 'Give glory to God. We know this man is a sinner.' He answered, 'Whether he is a sinner I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see.' They said to him, 'What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?' He answered them, 'I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?' And they reviled him, saying, 'You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from.'" Now notice what's happening here. They're denying Jesus in spite of the miracles, in spite of the works. And that's a pattern that we're beginning to see throughout the book of John. No matter what Jesus does, those that don't believe in him aren't going to believe in him. And those that see him are going to see him regardless of the signs. But the signs are done that there is a witness done for Jesus Christ. And so we see that the blind Pharisees doubt the seeing blind man without reason. And as we jump into verses 30 through 34, I think this is amazing that we get to see a little bit of what happens to the blind man, and then they get kicked out. So we get to see in 30 through 34, "The man answered, 'Why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. But if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing.' And then they answered him," verse 34, they answered him, "You were born in utter sin, and would you teach us?" And they cast him out. And then they cast him out, obviously, from their midst and probably from the temple fellowship, disavowing him as a follower of Jesus. But I want us to recognize something that's going on here, that this miracle has never been done before. Jesus has already restored sight to two people, but that has been done in people that already could see. That could have been, looking back, obviously, that could have been a cataract or something that would have impaired their sight after the fact. But the faculties were there in some way. Whereas with somebody that was born blind, they were born without any ability to see anything. It was as if their optic nerves were gone, or they didn't have pupils, or something was completely disconnected. And so Jesus has healed something that would have been viewed as impossible and had never been done in that way. The blind had never been healed in the biblical account if they were born that way. And so we can't miss that that's happening here. The blind man uses this evidence to point to the obvious conclusion that whoever did this for him must have been sent from God, since God would never do miracles like this through someone that he didn't send, through a sinner. And so notice how John is continuing this theme of evidence throughout the book. And what was the purpose of the book? Again, look to John chapter 20, verse 31 to see that the purpose of the book of John is to recount all of these miracles that people might believe in Jesus Christ. So then in 35, we haven't seen Jesus in a couple of verses, and so we get to see him again. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" He answered, "And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Look, notice that in verse 36, the man is already looking. He's already searching. He recognizes that if he finds the Son of Man, if he finds this Messiah, this Savior, then he will follow him. Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you." Something amazing then happens in verse 38 that I don't want us to miss. And I think I have a note about this in our, at the end of this slide. If we read verse 38, it says, "He said, 'Lord, I believe,' and he worshiped him." Jesus reveals himself to the blind man as Savior and Messiah. And then the once blind man follows Jesus and worships Jesus. I want us to notice that that's happening. Jesus has already claimed to be divine, to be God several times. That is amazing. But the fact that this man worships, bows down to Jesus and worships him is unbelievable. And Jesus accepts it and is not struck dead. Nothing happens because he is God. So as we get to see this happens because this man worships Jesus in a way that not even angels would take that worship. If you turn over to Revelation chapter 22, remember from our prologue that Revelation is also written by the Apostle John. So we're going to see some similar language being used there. But in chapter 22, verses 8 and 9, we get to see the reaction to something that John tries to worship an angel. And the angel says, no, please don't do that. And he says in verse 8 and 9, "I, John, am the one who heard and saw these things. And when I heard and saw them, I fell down to worship at the feet of the angel who showed them to me. But he said to me, 'You must not do that. I am a fellow servant with you and your brothers, the prophets, and with those who keep the words of this book. Worship God.'" So don't worship anyone else. Worship God. Well, what is this man doing? Worshiping God. And so in verses 40 and 41, we get some words of warning. It says, for Jesus said, we're going to start out in verse 39. Jesus said, "For judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." Some of the Pharisees heard these things and said to him, "Are we also blind?" Jesus said to them, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say, 'We see,' your guilt remains." Recognize that the Pharisees are saying that we have no wrong. We are perfect. We are following the law and the customs. And a word of warning: if you think you have no sin, you are wrong. 1 John chapter 1, verses 8 and 9, again from the Apostle John, says that if you say you have no sin, you're a liar, and the truth is not within you. So I encourage you to read that. Go back and watch this video again if you missed any references. I want you to go back and check on all of those things and make sure that you understand this fully. And keep that image in your mind. Muddy hands from Jesus' miracle of healing the blind man. Make sure you watch this video before video 10 because we're going to use some of the same ideas and apply them forward for this video.